Hey class, so in this lesson I'm going to go over watercolor techniques with you. I would like for you to practice these watercolor techniques so that you can apply them to your project eventually. You're going to need your watercolor paints, your extra palette, water. You're going to need a paper towel. You're going to need some paint brushes. And if you have at home, which I'm sure you do, salt. So what I did is I took a little bit of salt and just put it on and carefully put it on an extra paper towel off to the side, right? You're probably wondering why I already put color in my layering area, and I'll explain that later. But the first thing I would like to do is set up our piece of paper, all right? So the first thing that you're gonna wanna do is take out of the bag that I gave you the half sheet of paper, all right? So you should have 2 pieces of watercolor paper and then 1 half sheet of watercolor paper. What you're gonna do is set up your paper in 8 different spots. I have like 8 different sections for it, all right? So in order to do that, what I would do is first just fold your paper in half. Okay. Now, your watercolor paper is thick. It's like a thicker stock paper, so it might be a little bit harder to fold. So just be careful when you're folding it. So now it's split in half, right? Then, what you're gonna wanna do is fold it in half the other way. So now I have 4, okay? Now I got a little bit of paint on the back of mine. Then what I would do, because I'm working in a tight space here, is take one side and fold that in half. So now you have 4 on that side. And then fold it in half. Miss Stauble's making a mess here. I got paint all over my table. So now I have 8 sections to work on. Now, what you can do, after I just clean up my little mess I made here, and what I did is I just took a pen and I kind of made those divides a little bit more solid. And then I added in each of the different techniques. All right, so you're gonna wanna take a minute to maybe pause the video and add in the techniques that you're going to be learning. All right, after you do that, we're ready to start. Okay, so a solid wash is just really being able to push the paint around consistently, all right, in one solid value, no variation. So what I want you to do is just pick any color that you would want. Okay, so wet your paintbrush and choose a color. I'm gonna choose my Viridian green. What I'm gonna do is on my palette, add a little bit of water and some of the green so I get a nice mixture. I'm gonna take this paint, really soak my paintbrush up, take it to the solid wash, and just push my paint around. So what you can see is the watercolor, as you push, the pool of water kind of pools in one direction as you push it. So you kind of want to push that pool of water around. And you want to do it fairly quickly because watercolor dries quickly. So notice how I'm pushing all those pools of water right here and around all at the same time. And now I have this. If you go over areas a few times, try not to because it sometimes leaves weird variations between the watercolor. If you're trying to get like a solid formation of color. All right, so that would be a solid wash. All right, a value scale. Value in art means how dark or light something is. So this would be understanding the value of your watercolor. So what I'm going to say you can do is create 3 different values, blocking the value. So I'm going to stick with my green, and I'm going to make 1 value of green. This is going to be my darkest value of green. In watercolor, if you want to make your color darker, you just add more watercolor to it and less water, okay? So you can see I added less water and more watercolor. There's my first value, okay? So now, if I wanted to make this lighter, I would pull a little bit of that darker green into another pool and just keep adding water to this, making it a little bit lighter. So now there's less paint, more water. So when I go to create my second, the middle value, actually I might add a little bit more. Same color, lighter value, because there's less paint, more water. And that would be my middle value. Now, if I really wanted to make it a lot lighter, make a third value, I'm going to add even more water, less paint. Now I have the lightest value. Okay. So that would be a value scale, going from dark value, middle value, to a light value. Layering. So now you're probably wondering again why I already put some sort of shape down. It's important to be aware of how to control your watercolor. So when you're using watercolor, and you want to, watercolor is very transparent. So when you're using it, you can layer your paints on top of one another. However, watercolor also, when layering paints on top of one another, if it's not dry, they'll all bleed together, meaning they'll all kind of blend together, which I'll show you when we start maybe doing like lifting or something. I'll show you how to do that. So it's important that if you're going to layer colors of watercolor, that you allow time for them to dry before you place other colors on top of. So for instance, I put this red on a few minutes ago. I let it dry. It's completely dry. Now I can go and add another color, and I'm going to show you how transparent it is and how you can layer. So I'm going to take yellow, okay, and I'm going to just layer yellow on top of, okay. I'm going to take my yellow, and I'm just going to put like another shape through here, okay. So you can see that when I add my yellow, it's hard to see actually, but when I add my yellow on top of, you can see that it's transparent, it shows through. And when you put the yellow on top of the red, it turns orange, right? So that would be layering. Understand that you can layer paints on top of one another. Now, if I did that when it was wet, it would all bleed together. Okay. Which maybe I'll show you when we scumble. All right, lifting. So the really cool thing about watercolor is that you can lift the paint up with paper towels to create cool textures. So let's say I wanted to make like a sky, and I wanted to lift, or an ocean, and I wanted to lift paint up to make it look like clouds, or maybe even like the ocean, the waves, like the crest of the waves. What I can do is place my color down onto my paper. Okay. And while it's still wet, I can take some of my paper towel. Okay, I just ripped a little piece of paper towel off. And I can lift the paint. So I'm pressing the paper towel down and lifting up. You can see that it's creating a cool little texture on here. Okay. You can do this when the paint is dry as well. Not that I want you to do this, but if I were going to go onto my red here that's dry and add water, which actually that's dirty water. Okay. I can take a paper towel and attempt to lift up from that as well. So really, if you make a mistake, just know that you can take some water, lay it down onto your watercolor paper, and use paper towel to lift the paint up. And you can get most of that watercolor up from the paper. Right? It's the beauty of watercolor. The next technique is dry brush. All right, so dry brush is just using very, very little water and mostly your paints. Okay, so your paints are like hard. Okay, if you had tubes of paints, you could take the tube of paint. Mine are still wet because I just did this, and I can literally dry it off on a paper towel and lightly dry brush, meaning taking a dry brush and dry paint and run it onto, like almost like a texture onto your watercolor. Okay. Now you can do this with the paints that you have too. Just wet it, but try to use less of your water and more just like dry, what would be considered dry paint. So I'm drying it off, dry brush, dry paint, and then you can create cool textures using the dry paint on your watercolor. So you can see the look of that is very different from the other ones. Okay, water drops. So these are now, like, I'm starting to get into really more like creating textures with your watercolor. So let's say, I don't know, I wanted to create a fun texture using water droplets. Okay, I'm gonna just keep using blue here. So I'm gonna put some blue down. Okay. So you can see I'm not pushing my paints around very well on this one like I did in the first. So you can see how even the paint is on my solid wash versus how uneven my paints are for this one. Okay. Okay. So, water drops. What you could do is take your water on your paintbrush and kind of just drop it onto the area. And it may be hard to see, but it's actually pushing my paint around. And over time, if you allow it to sit, it's going to just move even more so and create interesting little textures on my watercolor. All right. One of the really beautiful things about watercolor, and even challenging things, is that you don't have full control over it. the water also takes control. You almost want to allow the water to take control of some of your watercolor. Okay, so for instance, an example would be like this. I'm putting droplets on it and allowing the water to create the texture. I'm not creating it, I'm allowing the water to help me with this. You could also take like other colors, say an experiment here, add some water, like green water to it and do water droplets of green. Let's see what happens. Okay, now I'm almost like splattering all over this, which is fine. Okay. And see what happens. You're gonna see that that's wet paint reacting to a wet paint, two different colors. And maybe not right now, maybe not right now you'll see it, but as time goes on, it might spread more and what we call bleed more. And that's also another really pretty technique to add cool textures and patterns to your watercolor. All right. I'm going to do the next two, but before I do, just to also kind of keep in mind, my water's green right now, okay? You want, and it's okay, I mean, it's not terrible, but if your water gets really, really muddy, you want to make sure that you clean it. You clean your water as much as possible because the water in this container is a part of the watercolors that you're mixing. So if you're using a really muddy water and applying it and mixing it with your yellow is not going to be as vibrant. It's going to be more of a dirty yellow. So you need to be careful with your water. And this really goes in a sense for any paints that you use that you mix with water. Okay. Scumbling. Scumbling would be like another texture, and it would be more like dots or lines. So for instance, scumbling would be like creating lines like this for texture of grass, or dots, small dots or textures that you might create for leaves or whatnot. So any type of texture would be scumbling. So what I might actually do is let this dry a little bit and then layer another green on top of it to create variation in the texture that I created. If I didn't want to really define each of these little marks, what I could do is apply the texture on top of while it's still wet. So now I have another green. I created another green here, and I'm going to add that down here. So you can see when I add it, I'm now scumbling two colors together, but they're almost bleeding into one another. They're blending together because the paint is wet. Now I'm going to let this dry, and hopefully when I finish this, some of this is dry, and I'll scumble on top of this being dry, and you'll see that those formations will still stay the same. They won't bleed together like on the bottom. So another type of texture that's cool, even for sand, because we're doing a lot of beachy things, if you wanted to create like a sand texture, taking your salt from your kitchen cabinet, okay? So what I'm going to do is maybe use my yellow ochre. Yellow ochre is a really pretty color, natural color. And I'm just going to lighten it a little bit more. And I might actually add maybe a little lemon yellow to it, just to brighten it up a little bit more. Oops, you can't really see what I'm doing here. Okay, more of a gold, I guess. Okay. But notice, again, I'm using my water, which is green. So if I used water that was clear, may not... You know what? I might make this a little bit darker just because I want you to be able to see what I'm doing here. So I'm going to, even though I just made a lighter color, I'm going to now make a darker color. So I'm pushing all my paints Remember, I said try not to go over your colors too much. It loses its vibrancy when you continuously go over. Try to just do one coat. Okay, now I've got this beachy color down. So now I'm going to do is I'm going to take some salt, okay, and I'm going to just sprinkle it onto and what it does is it absorbs the water, and it creates a really cool texture on top of the watercolor. So what I'm going to do, and you can't see it now, but when I show you later, you'll see it. It's starting to absorb the color, I should say, and then it kind of like creates these little specks on the watercolor. Creates a really cool texture. So what I'm going to do is leave it there. I'm going to leave it there until it dries completely, and then I'm going to wipe the salt off, and it's going to create a really cool texture. So now I'm going to go back to this area here. So this is still wet. This area is dry. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just go back in with my lighter green and just show you that when I go to scumble on top of these textures, there's no bleeding, right? Because these paints are now dry, and I'm just layering on top of. Where on the bottom here, I use the two colors, but I use them one right after the other, wet on wet. So it creates more of a bleeding effect, meaning all those colors are blended together. You're not really seeing my scumbling as much in here as you're seeing up above in here. All right, so this is the activity that I would like you to start working on. If you have any questions, let me know.